Okay, so last week we have learned embodied carbon. So for a building, we need to consume many different kind of material resources for constructing the building in day one. Okay, so initial embodied carbon. So that would be the carbon emissions due to consuming that material. And for that material, it is in a life cycle concept. Okay, so the material will be consumed when we extract that material. Okay, so some carbon emissions will be resulted due to extracting that material and then process the material, transport the material to a factory, and then further manufacturing, and then transporting to a warehouse. Okay, that would be the cradle to site, okay, or cradle to grave, okay, and we have different kind of boundary. Okay, so it depends on how you differentiate that boundary. Okay, so apart from the raw materials for constructing the building, there will also be renovation from time to time. Okay, so in the when the building is in operation, the furnishing like the carpets, okay, or some of the equipment, okay, needs to be replaced. So these will also be counted towards the embodied carbon. Okay, yeah. So last week we have studied the embodied carbon, okay, which include the initial embodied carbon and the recurring embodied carbon, okay, due to renovation, maybe every 5 years, and refurbishment, and so on. Okay, and today we will look into operating carbon and the whole carbon footprint. Okay, so operating carbon is very easy to understand. Okay, that would be the carbon emissions due to the operation phase of the building. Okay, like this classroom, okay, it is the operation phase, and when it is operated, it will consume different kind of energy. I think mostly in Hong Kong for a building, it will consume electricity. Okay, but not just electricity, maybe town gas. Okay, so this energy, when it is consumed, it will result in some carbon emissions. So these are operating carbon. Okay, so I think the concept of operating carbon will be much easier than that of embodied carbon. So the carbon emissions due to electricity, gas, and other fuels used in a building for heating, cooling, ventilation, lighting, hot water, computer, servers, and other equipment. Okay, these would be the operating carbon. Okay, like in this classroom, when it is operated, okay, we need to turn on the lighting, the computer, the air conditioning, okay, and some more equipment. Okay, and maybe the lift, okay, the escalator, and then the water supply. We have the pumps, we have the fans for ventilation, for extracting the foul air in the toilets, and so on. So all these will result in operating carbon, okay, carbon emissions. And the operating carbon is highly related to energy consumption, maybe electricity, maybe other kind of fuel. Okay, and the energy consumption will be affected by building type. So whether it is a commercial building or residential or a restaurant or retail shop, shopping center, okay, all these will affect the like carbon emissions per square meter. And the building area, okay, definitely larger building will probably result in a higher carbon emissions. Number of occupants. So number of occupants will affect the number of equipments. Okay, like in an office, okay, every employee will have his own computer, laptop, and it will affect the operating, the consumption by the small equipment, okay, the small power consumption, and therefore the operating carbon. And the number of occupants will also affect the air conditioning, okay, and some more consumption. Operating schedule, okay, so typically, like for a classroom in PolyU, it will operate from 8:30 all the way to 9:30. Okay, but for an office building, maybe the operation hours will be shorter. Okay, but for Hong Kong, we work overtime often. So comparatively, I think the operating time duration for an office building in Hong Kong will be longer than like in the Europe. So benchmark is not meaningful if the above are not specified. Okay, so in this lecture, we will look into some benchmark data from UK and also in Hong Kong. Okay, and these benchmark will be for your reference. Okay, but you have to understand that they will be based on some assumption. Okay, like I will tell you, maybe the benchmark for operating carbon for a building is around like 200 or maybe 100 kg of carbon dioxide per square meter. Okay, but this is based on some assumption. Okay, and you have to understand these assumptions. Otherwise, these data will not be meaningful. Okay, like the building type, and then how did you what would be the operation hours assumption and so on. Okay, benchmarking units. So building needs two forms of energy to operate. So very often electricity, right? So we need electricity, typically sourced from the national or regional electricity grid. Okay, so we consume electricity which is supplied by the utility company. Like in Hong Kong, it will be either supplied by CLP, China Light and Power, or the HEC, Hong Kong Electric. Another kind of power, I think not too often in Hong Kong, but in UK or in Europe, okay, they need heating, okay, the heating system. So they need electricity, maybe for lighting, for the equipment, and then for other small power. And at the same time, they also need the heat, okay, because in the UK, they need heating, especially in the winter, and they have a long winter. So heat usually generated in buildings using one or a combination of the following. Okay, maybe generate heating by electricity, okay, electrical heater, maybe a gas heater, a boiler, okay, or maybe by burning biomass, biofuel, diesel, or oil, or outside buildings using district heating network. Okay. So for the first part of this lecture, we will be referring to a book which study the operating carbons of buildings in the UK. Okay, so for the first half of the lecture, we will be focusing, or we will be using buildings in UK as an example for the study of operating carbons. 3 contenders to benchmark operating energy consumption would be, okay, so to benchmark or like to calculate, okay, to list out all the operating energy consumption in buildings, we may use the unit energy consumption, right? It's very straightforward. So to calculate or to quantify the operating energy, then we use kilowatt hour, okay? And here, this kilowatt hour, it means the metered energy consumption, okay? Like when you refer to your electricity bill, okay? When you need to pay for the electricity, then you can check the consumption, right? So how many units, how many kilowatt hour? So this is the metered energy consumption. So maybe for electricity, for the town gas, you have the metered energy consumption. And apart from this kilowatt hour, we have another parameter with the same unit, also kilowatt hour, but this is primary energy consumption. Okay, so in the lecture last week, we have briefly explained primary energy. Okay, primary energy would be the kind of energy that had not been gone through any human processing. Okay, like okay, for natural gas, okay, it is something found in deep underground. Okay, but if you process it, okay, like the fossil fuel, okay, if you process the fossil fuel, it can become petroleum. Okay, then petroleum is not primary energy. Or, very obviously, electricity is not primary energy. Okay, because we have to burn some like natural gas and then go through the power plant, and then there will be some power wastage, and then the power plant will not be 100% efficient, so that it can generate certain amount of electricity in kilowatt hour. So we are converting primary energy in kilowatt hour into electricity in kilowatt hour. Okay, so the amount of fuel content in the natural gas or in the oil, in the coal, and these are the primary energy. Okay, the amount of heat energy in the fuel, and they are the kilowatt hour primary energy consumption. Okay, and the last parameter that can allow us to do the benchmarking would be the carbon dioxide emissions. And we have learned the equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent value. Okay, so here when you see E equivalent, so it means that we have converted the quantity of other greenhouse gases, okay, using global warming potential into carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so we may use this to quantify the global warming impact. The energy, primary energy. Primary energy is the energy that exists in a naturally occurring form, such as coal, oil, natural gas, that has not been subjected to any conversion or transformation process, okay, without any human process or artificial process. So conversion of primary energy into secondary energy involves various technology and process. Okay, some process may be more efficient, some less efficient. Okay, like so for grid electricity, and there are different reference. Okay, so different reference source may give you different so-called efficiency value. So if we refer to the passive huts, okay, this value is 2.7, and the unit is kilowatt hour primary for every kilowatt hour final. So it means in order to produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity energy, you have to consume 2.7 kilowatt hour of primary energy. Okay, and this value actually will depend on the fuel mix of the electricity power plant. So whether they burn coal or oil or natural gas, and what are the proportion, and what is the efficiency of the power plant, and other factors. Okay, so this is only a reference, and for different power plant, different locations, this value will be different. Okay, so this is only an example. Okay, in this table, these are only for your reference. Okay, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Consuming operating energy release greenhouse gas emissions either at the building or at the power stations. So what does it mean? So if we use a natural gas boiler within the building, okay, then we are burning the natural gas within the building, and the carbon dioxide will be released right here, right? Local emissions, we call it local emissions. Or if we consume electricity, okay, like we are not using a natural gas boiler, but we are using an electric boiler, okay, not electric, but electric heater. Okay, if we are using an electric heater, then there will not be any local carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, because for electricity, yeah, we consume electricity here, but there will not be any carbon dioxide emissions within the building. But far away in the power plant, there will be carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so the carbon dioxide emissions can be local in the building. Okay, like when you really burn the fuel within the building, then we have the local emissions. Or we have indirect emissions, okay, like consuming electricity. And because we consume this amount of electricity, then it indirectly results in certain carbon dioxide emissions in the power plant. Okay, so this is indirect emissions. And the unit can be kilogram or tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is the equivalent to the global warming potentials of 1 kg, or if you use ton, then 1 ton of carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. Okay, so this is rather typical, okay, 100 year, and we use carbon dioxide as an equivalent. So the calculations of carbon dioxide equivalent, how many kg? So first of all, we need to work out the annual operating energy consumption for each energy source. Maybe for the electricity bill, okay, we collect all the electricity bill in the whole year, and we calculate the total electricity consumption in the whole year, okay, and the unit will be kilowatt hour. And then multiply these totals by the appropriate carbon dioxide equivalent emission factor. And for example, if I want to calculate the operating carbon of my home, then I will collect the electricity bill, okay, for the whole year. And I lived in the new territories. So the provider of electricity will be CLP, and I can go to the website of the CLP to check its emission factor. Okay, maybe 0.4 something, okay, kg carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Okay, then I can use this emission factor multiply by the total electricity consumption at my home, and I will be able to find out the operating carbon due to electricity consumption. Okay, but for my home, apart from electricity, I also consume town gas. So I need to check also the town gas bill and then find out the total units of consumption multiplied by the emissions factor by the town gas. Then adding up the carbon footprint, the carbon emissions by electricity, and I will have the total operating carbon for my home. Okay, and actually it's very straightforward. Okay, calculating the operating carbon is rather straightforward. Okay, check the bill and then use the emission factors. Indicative emissions factor used for the calculations of operating carbon in the UK. So for the first half of the lecture, it is based on a book which is published in the UK, and it studies not just operating carbon, but also the embodied carbon, transport carbon of many buildings in the UK. Okay, and for the book, the author used these emissions factor value. Like for electricity, the emission factor would be 0.6 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent for every kilowatt hour of electricity consumption. Or for natural gas, the emission factor is 0.2 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent for every kilowatt hour of natural gas energy consumption. Okay, so these are the conversion from energy into carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, and these emissions factor would be totally different when the buildings are located elsewhere. Okay, so these are only a reference for buildings in the UK, and the book was published some years ago, so maybe the current value would be different. Okay, because we are moving towards the carbon neutrality. So maybe in the UK, maybe they generate electricity more on renewable energy. Okay, then it will affect the emissions factor for grid electricity. Okay. So let's study one example. So in the UK, a room requires 2 kilowatts of heat. Okay, heat energy or heating power. We need 2 kilowatts of heating power for 5 hours. Calculate the primary energy consumption and carbon emissions if an electric heater or a gas boiler central heating system is used. So in this example, 2 kilowatts of power, and it will last for 5 hours. So multiply 5 hours. So the energy that we need would be 10 kilowatt hour. Okay, the heating energy that we need would be 10 kilowatt hour. And we assume the electricity, the electric heater will have 100% efficiency. Okay, so it means we need 10 kilowatt hour, and the electricity consumed will be 10 kilowatt hour, and then divided by 100%. That is same. Okay, also 10 kilowatt hour of electricity. Okay, this would be the electricity consumption in order to provide this amount of heat in the space. And for the boiler, the efficiency is 90%. So for the boiler, if the heat that we need is 10, and we divide it by 90%, so this would be the energy consumed of natural gas, or the gas. And the emission factor for electricity will be 0.6, which is just the same value that we have seen in this table. And for natural gas, 0.2. So here 0.6 and 0.2, right? So if you want to find out the amount of carbon emissions due to consuming this amount of electricity, then very easy, just multiply 0.6. Right? And then for the carbon emissions due to consuming this amount of energy of natural gas, then we multiply by the emissions factor of 0.2. Then we have the carbon emissions due to the use of the gas boiler. And in this question, we are also given the tariff, okay, the money that you need to pay. So for electricity, it would be 12.6 pence for every kilowatt hour of electricity consumption. Okay, so 10 kilowatt hour and then multiply by 12.6, that would be the money, okay, the fees, the electricity fees. And if you are using the gas boiler, the fees will be 3.9 pence for every kilowatt hour. So once again, this multiply 3.9. You have the fees, okay, the charge for the natural gas. So the answer, the calculations will be summarized in this table. For electric heater or the gas boiler, we need to produce, okay, we need the output of 10 kilowatt hour of heat energy. And for the electric heater, the system efficiency is 100%. So 10 divided by 100%, so the electricity consumption will be same, 10, okay, 10 kilowatt hour. And for the gas boiler, the efficiency is 90%. So 10 divided by 90%, so we have 11.1. So we need to consume 11.1 kilowatt hour of energy, okay, by the natural gas in order to produce 10 kilowatt hour of heating energy. Okay, maybe there is some leakage, or maybe the combustions is not 100% efficient, so it results in 90% efficiency of the gas boiler. And then the emissions factor, okay, is given to be 0.6 for electricity and 0.2 for natural gas, for burning natural gas. So if you want to calculate the carbon emissions, we use the emission factor multiplied by the energy consumption, okay, the metered energy consumption. And we have 6 for electric heater. And for the gas boiler, the emission factor is 0.2, and the metered energy consumption is 11.1, not 10. Okay, you should use 11.1 because this is the actual energy that being consumed. Okay, the actual amount of energy being consumed. So 11.1 multiplied 0.2, so we have 2.2 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so just comparing the carbon dioxide emissions using the natural gas boiler will give you less carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, but this is only for a demonstration of calculations. Okay, different region, different location, different country will have different emission factors. Okay, and for the tariff, okay, so metered energy multiplied by the unit charge, then you have the cost. And the primary energy factor for electricity, in the table earlier, we have 2.7 for electricity, and natural gas 1.1. So referring to the primary energy factor, okay, for using 2.7, then 10 multiply 2.7, and we have 27 of energy, primary energy consumption. So it means in order to produce 10 kilowatt hour of electricity, we need to consume 27 kilowatt hour of primary energy. And for the gas boiler, the factor is 1.1. So in order to produce 11.1 kilowatt hour of natural gas energy, okay, we have to consume 12.2 kilowatt hour of primary energy. Okay, so this is only an example, and for our subject, we will be focusing on the carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, not the primary energy. Okay, we will be calculating the carbon dioxide emissions. So instead of the amount of primary energy used, carbon dioxide equivalent is usually adopted for the quantification of operating carbon. Because many building energy rating tools use carbon dioxide equivalent as the matrix, and reducing the greenhouse gas emissions is a pressing environmental issue. Okay, so primary energy is more about the consumption of the resources. Okay, but if you want to pinpoint to the problem of global warming, then we should focus on the carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, different forms of transport are also typically compared by carbon dioxide emissions, not primary energy, and primary energy factors are less widely available. So we don't have the primary energy factors in every region, okay, but for the carbon dioxide emissions factor, it is more common. Okay, so like from CLP or HEC or the town gas company, you can check out the carbon dioxide emission factor, but you may not be able to find out the primary energy factor. And primary energy factors can be ambiguous, and associated calculation methods are not harmonized, not standardized, transparent, or consistent. Okay, so nowadays we will tend to use the carbon dioxide equivalent as a comparison. So operating carbon of a building per unit gross floor area can be calculated by this equation, which is very straightforward. Okay, the total energy consumption should be in kilowatt hour. Okay, total energy consumption in kilowatt hour, and then multiply by the emission factor. So it should be kg or ton of carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Okay, so energy consumption multiplied by the emissions factor, the corresponding emission factor. So if the energy that we are calculating is electricity, then you should check out the emission factor for the electricity. Okay, so like for my home, I check the electricity bill and I find out the whole year I consume this amount of electricity, and then I go to CLP, okay, go to the website of CLP to check its emission factor. But if you live in Hong Kong Island, okay, then the provider of electricity will be Hong Kong Electric. Then you should go to the website of Hong Kong Electric and check its emission factor. Okay, so this emission factor will depend on the region, okay, whether it is Hong Kong or UK or China, and also depends on the location of the building. Like in Hong Kong, we have 2 providers of electricity. Okay, emission factor that convert kilowatt hour into kg carbon dioxide equivalent depends on the fuel mix. So whether you only use fossil fuel, or maybe you also use renewable energy, or maybe you use nuclear power. Okay, so all these fuel mix will affect the emission factor. Okay, so the types of primary energy sources used to generate electricity. Okay, the proportion, natural gas, coal, oil, nuclear power, or renewable energy. Okay, all these will affect the emission factor. The efficiency of the power generation. Okay, the type of generating plant, and then the efficiency, and whether you have renewable energy. Okay, the proportion of renewable energy sources in the utility electricity mix. So all these will affect the emission factor. Okay, so for Hong Kong, I think CLP emission factor is 0.3 something. And for HEC, the emission factor is 0.5 something, which is higher than that of CLP, because CLP import electricity from Daya Bay power plant, which is a nuclear plant. Okay, so it results in a lower emission factor for CLP. Okay, electricity supplied to a building from the national or regional grid is generated from a variety of energy sources, which release different amounts of greenhouse gas per unit of electricity generated. Annual emission factor are used to determine the kg carbon dioxide equivalent released for each kilowatt hour of grid electricity consumed at the point of final use. The factors vary for different countries and different years depending on the proportion of fossil fuel used to generate the electricity and the losses in the distribution network, typically based on a 5-year rolling average. So this is just what we have mentioned. Okay, so different power company and different year, it will have different emission factor. Okay, for CLP, the current value should be 0.3 something, but several years ago, they have a higher emission factor. Okay, but now the emission factor is getting lower and lower. Okay, so the carbon dioxide equivalent emissions factor. So in order to calculate the carbon footprint, first of all, we convert the activity data into kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. So for example, the activity data can be how many fuel being used. Okay, so maybe you burn some oil, okay, or maybe some LPG, okay, and if it is a transport, okay, so maybe you are calculating the carbon footprint or the carbon emissions of a car, okay, then you can also find out the record of how many miles, how many km has been driven, okay, or how many fuel, how many diesel oil has been consumed, or if it is the carbon emissions due to tons of due to waste sent to the landfill, then how many? Okay, how many? What is the weight of the of the rubbish being sent to the landfill? Then we can use some emission factor to convert them into the carbon emissions. Okay, and these emission factors, okay, maybe for electricity, maybe for burning natural gas, maybe for the fuel being, or maybe for the waste being sent to the landfill, or the consumptions of diesel oil in the car, okay? So these emission factor can be referred to some document. If it is possible, we should refer to the local publication, okay, local publication. But if you cannot find it from the local publication, then we can refer to some international standards, okay, like those reports published by the IPCC and governments in different countries. So these emissions factor will be used for different purposes, including building regulation, corporate reporting, emission trading, building rating tools, and so on. Okay? So we have some standard emissions factor for calculating the carbon footprint, for reporting the carbon footprint, maybe some listed company in the stock market, okay, they need to issue the ESG report. So they have to document their carbon footprint. So all these will be based on the carbon dioxide emission factor, okay, different types of carbon dioxide emissions factor. This figure explains the calculations of emission factor from a typical coal-fired power plant. So let's say we have 1 kg of coal and the heat content, okay, the fuel, the heat content of 1 kg of coal would be 6.67 kilowatt hour of energy. Okay, this is the amount of heat energy in 1 kg of coal. So when you burn the coal in the in the power plant, okay, so when you burn the coal, it will produce the steam, okay, and the steam will drive the turbine, and the turbine can generate electricity, okay, and the electricity will be sent to the consumer through the electricity grid system. And during this process, some of the energy will be lost. Okay, when you burn the coal, may not 100% of energy will be released. Okay, some will be lost, and then in the turbine there would be some waste heat, and the conversion of mechanical energy into electricity will not be perfect. Okay, there will always be some electricity, will be some energy loss. So finally, okay, only 36% of the thermal energy is being converted into electricity. So 6.67 multiplied 36% will be 2.4 kilowatt hour. So in this process, there are some ways, and power plant is not 100% efficient, so it results in 2.4 kilowatt hour of electricity being output. Okay, so the input of primary energy would be 6.67 kilowatt hour of coal. Okay, this is the amount of primary energy. And then after some process, it generates 2.4 kilowatt hour of electricity. Okay, so not 100%. And during this process, okay, like when you burn the coal, it will release carbon dioxide and maybe nitrous oxide and other greenhouse gas. So by burning this amount of coal, 2.271 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent will be released. Okay, this amount of greenhouse gas will be released. So for calculating the emissions factor, okay, so we in the process, this amount of carbon dioxide will be released. Okay, so here 2.271 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent, and these amount of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas will be released for every 2.4 kilowatt hour of electricity being generated. Okay, so it results in an emission factor of 0.95 kg carbon dioxide equivalent for every kilowatt hour. All right, so it is a simplified diagram to explain how to evaluate the emission factor. Okay, so in the coming slides, once again, it is referring to that book published in the UK, and it tries to evaluate the lowest operating carbon of a building in the UK. So what is the lowest practical operating carbon of an office building in UK? So this publication wants to find out a benchmark for the carbon footprint of an office building. And it used the concept of whole carbon footprint. So it evaluates what is the typical embodied carbon of an office building in UK. And it also wants to find out the typical operating carbon in the UK. Okay, so before it can find out a benchmark, the author wants to calculate what could be the lowest operating carbon footprint. And it is based on these assumptions. So one person for every 15 square meter of gross internal floor area, and everyone works on one laptop with no extra screen, and the office is occupied from 8 it should be 8 a.m. Okay, is this a typo? So 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. from Monday to Friday. The operating carbon will be highly dependent on the occupancy density, and then also the operation schedule. Okay, so we have to make some assumption. So this is the operation schedule. So from 8 in the morning and then 6 in the afternoon. So the operating hours will be around 10 hours a day, and then it works from Monday to Friday. So it means 50 hours for every week. Okay, and from this assumption, we can calculate the yearly operating hours of the building. Okay, and office is required to be thermally comfortable all year round. Occupants need fresh air, light, food, drink, and sanitation. No lift. So in the UK, the buildings are usually low rise. Okay, one floor, 2 floor, only a few stories. So in this assumption, there is no lift required. Okay, not high rise building, only low rise building. So no lift, no escalator. So this diagram summarizes the assumptions made by the author. Okay, the lighting around 4 watts per square meter with dimming system. So in the detailed calculation, it assumed that 50% of the operation time, the lighting will be dimmed to 50%. Okay, so the actual power density will be less than 4 watts per square meter. And it has heating, cooling system using heat pump, such that the energy consumption by the HVAC system would be 15 kilowatt hour per square meter every year. And the office consists of some small equipment like the server, and then phone, security system, printer, and the fridge, and some pantry, kitchen appliance, okay, the laptop, task lighting, the workstation, and it rely on natural ventilation and also active heating cooling system. Okay, but it has natural ventilation and good fabric, good building fabric. Okay, so here are just some assumptions for the author to do its calculation. So based on these assumptions, the author find out that the lowest energy office will consume 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, so 53 kilowatt hour per square meter every year. And by the end of the lecture, I will show you the Hong Kong case. So later, you will be able to compare the Hong Kong case to the lowest energy office consumption. So if we use the emission factor of 0.6, so remember earlier when we do the calculations, the emission factor for electricity in the UK is 0.6, right? 0.6 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. So if we use the same emissions factor, so 53 multiply 0.6, then we have this emissions, 32 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter per year. Okay, so these are just some calculations for the author to calculate 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. And using emission factor of 0.6, it results in the 32 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so just some calculations for the lowest energy office. And now let's see this case study. An office that occupies one floor of a 5-story natural ventilated building in the city center. The gross internal floor area is 195 square meter. It consists of 12 staff members, and the total annual electricity consumption is 13,100 kilowatt hour. Additional 3,100 kilowatt hour for the landlord's lift and common area lighting. So this is the tenant, okay, the tenant electricity consumption, and each tenant should be responsible for a portion of the landlord energy consumption. So let's say for this case, for this one floor, it is responsible for 3,100 kilowatt hour of the landlord's consumption. And we use the same emission factor of 0.6. Okay, then we can use this equation to calculate the carbon emissions of this one floor office in a year. So within the office, the energy consumption is 13,100 plus the landlord portion, so 3,100. This is the total energy consumption by this office. And multiply the emission factor of 0.6, and we divide it by the gross floor area, the internal area. So we have 50 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent for every square meter. Okay? And we can also calculate it per person. So instead of per unit area, we can also calculate the emissions per person. Okay, so just a simple calculations example. Okay, annual energy consumption per square meter. So just for the energy consumption, so this is the total energy consumption divided by the area. We will have 83 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, and the lowest would be 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. So this is based on the assumption here, right? If you remember, so based on this lowest energy consumption, it will result in 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, so 53 kilowatt hour per square meter will be this line, okay? And then for this case study, the energy consumption is 83 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, so for this case study, maybe it is probable to reduce the energy consumption to 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, so if it is the lowest, then this is the potential to reduce the energy consumption to the lowest value. Okay. And next, it is the DEC scheme, a voluntary energy labeling scheme in the UK. So DEC is for Display Energy Certification Scheme, and it is a energy benchmark scheme in the UK. So something like the energy efficiency labeling scheme in Hong Kong, but not for building. Okay, for Hong Kong, if you buy a refrigerator or an air conditioner or a dehumidifier, you will find the energy efficiency labeling scheme. Okay, that label. So maybe grade 1, grade 2. Okay, grade 1 is the best. Okay, so this DEC scheme is something similar to the energy efficiency labeling scheme. It's just that this scheme is specially for building. So when building join this voluntary scheme, it will stick the certificate, okay, at the entrance of the building, and so as to demonstrate how efficient is the building. So it raised the operating energy of the building occupants, not the landlord, okay, just the occupants. Comprise the direct meter energy consumption plus a proportion of landlord's energy consumption, just like in this case study. Okay, so this portion is the energy consumption by the tenant, and this part would be a proportion of the landlord's consumption. So, yeah, meter energy consumption plus a proportion of the landlord's energy consumption. Okay, maybe the heating or the cooling, the energy consumption in the common area. Typically allocated based on occupiers' leased area compared to the total leasable area in the building. So based on the floor area that you rent, okay, the larger the area, then the higher percentage you are responsible for the energy consumption in the public area. Reasonable? If a building has a single occupant, then the DEC rating is effectively the whole building rating. Okay, the CIBSE published energy benchmark for 29 building categories in this year, which then incorporate into the UK this DEC scheme. So if the emission factor in the UK is adopted, then the office benchmark will be 81 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter of gross internal floor area. So this is the benchmark based on the CIBSE publication. And the DEC rating, so whether you perform well or bad, will depend on the energy consumption comparing to the benchmark. Okay, comparing to the benchmark of 81. For example, okay, so here this is the rating, and let's say the consumption of my building is 93. Okay, let's say it's 93. Okay, then 93 multiply 100 and then divided by this benchmark of 81. So 93 multiply 100 divided by 81. So the rating is 115. 115 is between 101 and 125. So it means my building of 93 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. So if my building is 93 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter, then the category, okay, the scheme will give me E, gray, okay? And 100 will be typical, okay? So this typical will means the annual emissions of 81 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. So if your building emit more than this value, then your rating will be EFG. If the emissions is less than 81 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter, then your rating will be ABCD. Okay, A is the best. The less energy you consume, the better would be the efficiency rating. Okay, reasonable? According to the UK Government Energy Consumption Guide, energy benchmark for 8 types of office buildings are compared against the DEC rating scale. Okay, so the UK government has some publication showing or demonstrating the energy consumption for different types of building. Okay, like natural ventilation, okay, good performance. Okay, natural ventilation, typical performance, and then natural ventilation, open plan, good, and air-conditioned buildings. Okay, and they have different energy or emission value. And it is expected that if your building is naturally ventilated, then the energy consumption must be less, right? If it rely on the air conditioning, then the consumption will be higher. Okay, so it is found that if your office use air conditioning, then even if the performance is a good one, okay, even if it is a good one, you will only get a rating of E, okay, which is already the best. Okay, if you have a air conditioning in your building, so the best you will get E, and then probably you will get G, the rating, okay, which is not a good rating. Okay, and if the buildings are naturally ventilated, then maybe you can get B rating, C rating, or maybe D rating. And even for the lowest energy office that the author has calculated. So remember, we assume the lighting and then some value for the laptop, for the equipment, and it is calculated that the consumption is 53 kilowatt hour per square meter, right? So even for the lowest energy office, it only get the B rating. Okay, so the main point, okay, this diagram explain that it is very difficult to get a good rating according to this DEC scheme. Okay, even for the lowest energy office, the rating will only be B, and you can get better rating only if you rely on natural ventilation. And when you use air conditioning, then you will get E, F, or probably G rating. So the author explained that this DEC scheme is not popular. Okay, the participation rate of the DEC scheme is very low because most of the office has no the energy. The energy consumption is probably here in this region, so that they don't want to show that certificate. Okay, because G seems to be a poor performance, so they don't want to show this certificate. Okay, so good performance, air-conditioned prestige building gets the G rating only, and naturally ventilated buildings can typically achieve a D rating or better. And for the lowest operating carbon office has B rating only, not A, just B. So buildings can achieve A rating only if on-site renewable energy is utilized to generate electricity, maybe by PV panel or maybe some wind turbines and so on. And most large prestige commercial offices will only get a G rating. Okay, and the author also compared different different energy labeling scheme, building energy labeling scheme. One from Australia and one from the USA. And it found that for average, okay, like middle, okay, for the middle, so for Energy Star, the full point or the full mark is 100. So for the middle would be 50, okay, and for the NABAS in Australia, the maximum or the top rating is 6 star, while 2.5 is the medium. And then for this DEC certificate, the benchmark will be here, okay, and you can see that the benchmark is comparing to the rating in US or Australia is much higher. Okay, so for the medium in the US is the G rating only. Okay, and for the medium in Australia benchmark, also G rating only. Okay, another case study. Maybe after explaining this case study, we can take a short break. Okay, office building X has the following characteristic. Okay, we have the gross floor area, net lettable area, number of occupants or computers. So 1 occupant, 1 computer. And the hours of occupancy per week is 50. Okay, 50 hours of operation every week. And yeah, the area with heating and cooling, and the annual electricity consumption is this value. Annual gas consumption is this value. And we assume the primary energy factor for electricity is 3. Okay, so it means in order to produce this amount of electricity, the primary energy consumption would be this value multiplied by 3. Okay, and for gas, the value is 1.1. So in order to produce this amount of energy, gas, okay, we need to consume this amount multiplied 1.1 of primary energy. Okay, so for the primary energy consumption, so this value multiplied by 3 plus this value multiplied by 1.1 and divided by, yeah, just conversion, the area, okay, we divided by the area. So we have 533 kilowatt hour per square meter. And it will be the F rating for the DEC. And then for the Australia rating, around 3 stars. And for the US, the point will be 86 number of points. So for the same building, if it is according to the UK labeling scheme, not very good performance, okay, F rating. But according to the Australia, 3 star. Okay, for the US, high rating, 86. Okay, so this is to explain the difference of requirements among the energy labeling scheme for buildings in different countries. Okay, yeah, I know you are tired, so let's take a break and then we will continue after the break. Okay, so before the break, we have studied the lowest operating carbon office, and then we understand that the UK benchmark is a little bit stringent. Okay, so it's difficult to get a good grade if you are using the UK labeling scheme. And that's why the author of this book, okay, so half of the lecture will be based on this book. Okay, this is the book that I mentioned earlier, a UK publication studying the embodied carbon, the operating carbon, and the whole carbon footprint of many buildings in UK. So yeah, operating energy data from various sources are analyzed to find out the typical benchmark when the rating performance of office buildings in the UK. By using the emissions factor of the UK, a benchmark of 100 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter of gross internal floor area is proposed by the author of this book. Okay, so earlier the benchmark was 81, okay, 81 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this is according to the DEC scheme. And it is too strict, right? It is too strict comparing to the US scheme or the Australia scheme. So that's why the author proposed using 100 instead, okay, not 81, but using 100 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. So to establish appropriate benchmark in other countries, the influence of climate on energy consumption and energy sources used both need to be taken into consideration. So this is only for the UK based on the emission factor of 0.6. So don't apply it to buildings in Hong Kong directly, okay? Because in Hong Kong, the weather, okay, the climate is totally different from that of UK, okay? So this is only to demonstrate how can we set a benchmark. Okay, so using a benchmark, a new benchmark proposed by this author, 100 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. Okay, so yeah, we can you can see comparing. Okay, like for air-conditioned buildings and then standard, prestige. So based on different data, the author compare the carbon emissions with the benchmark. So this is only a reference. So buildings which have BREEAM ratings have won sustainability awards or have been cited in books or journals as exemplar case studies were analyzed and compared. So these are typical green buildings, okay, typical green buildings, and actually some has the carbon emissions much larger than that of the benchmark. Okay, so all these are so-called green buildings, okay, but quite a number of them has a carbon emissions larger than the benchmark. So a green design rating does not necessarily lead to a low energy building. Air-conditioned green office tend to have higher energy consumption than those with an ability to naturally ventilate it. Yeah, and I think this is very easy to understand. So if the building has rely on natural ventilation only, then the energy consumption, of course, will be lower. The majority of the best performing buildings are 2 to 3 story high and not located in the busy city center. So in the example here, okay, we have some buildings which with low carbon emissions rating. And most of them, they are just low-rise buildings and located in the suburban, okay, not in the city center. Okay, so these are some examples. Okay, these are the green buildings, and then some of them has much higher carbon emissions than the benchmark. Okay. So earlier, here we have some conclusion, right? So one of the key conclusions that I want you to remember is that most of the buildings with low operating carbon will be located away from the city center. Okay, so it means that for buildings with low operating carbon, it is far away from where the employees are living. Okay, so if you work in these buildings, you have to transport far away to work. And when you travel by public transport, or maybe you drive, okay, there will also be contribution to the carbon emissions. Okay, this is one of the key points which lead to the concept of whole carbon footprint by this author. Okay, so this will be explained very soon. But in the meantime, we want to talk about the operating carbon of office buildings in Hong Kong. So we have seen so many examples of buildings in the UK. So how about Hong Kong? So for Hong Kong situation, yeah, like in 2019, electricity generation was the largest source of carbon emissions. Okay, 66%. Due to 66% of the carbon emission is due to electricity generation. And then 80% due to the transportation, 7% due to waste. These three major emission sources together accounted for over 90% of the total emissions. And therefore, the three most critical areas of our decarbonization work. So if you want to reduce the carbon emissions in Hong Kong, we better focus on the carbon emissions due to electricity generation, and the carbon emissions due to transportation, and the carbon emissions due to the waste. Okay? And you may know that. So Hong Kong targets to achieve carbon neutrality before 2050. Some statistics that is extracted from the Energy End Use Data 2023. So in the 2021, 59% of the energy use is electricity. Other will be town gas, LPG, and oil and coal product. And 67%, so 43% of the energy is consumed in commercial building. 24% of the energy consumption is in residential building. So if we add up these two percentage, it will be 67%. So 67% of the energy is consumed in buildings. So maybe electricity, maybe town gas. Okay, so for electricity use, 94% will be consumed in buildings. So for electricity consumption, 29% in residential building, 65% in commercial building. So adding 29 and 65, you have 94. So in Hong Kong, 94% of the electricity consumption will be in buildings. Okay, so if you want to lower the carbon emissions, the largest portion, okay, the largest source of carbon emissions in Hong Kong is due to electricity generation. And 94% of the electricity generated is actually for buildings. Okay, and how did we consume electricity in the buildings? We have the lighting, the air conditioning, and then all these building services system. They contribute to most of the electricity and therefore most of the carbon emissions. Okay, for Hong Kong case. And some more data for residential breakdown, the energy breakdown for residential building and commercial building, just for your reference. And yeah, commercial building, 90% electricity, and for residential building, 71% electricity. For commercial building, electricity or energy consumption, okay, most of the energy consumption will be on the air conditioning system. And for residential, also, okay, air conditioning, cooking, and the hot water supply for residential. And for commercial will be air conditioning, and then cooking, and then lighting. Okay, so if you still remember the benchmark for UK building, the lowest energy consumption is 53, right? 53 kilowatt hour per square meter. This is the lowest value. And then, so let's see the Hong Kong's performance. So this is a table that I found from the EMSD website, and it is about the energy utilization index. And for different kind of office, grade A, grade B, grade C, and then industrial office building, and restaurant, retail, and others. So these are the benchmark, okay? Like for grade A office, the benchmark is around 400 megajoule per square meter. And this is based on the internal floor area, okay, for your reference. And the EMSD also has the benchmarking tool. So if you want, you can click this link and then go to a benchmarking tool, so you can input the electricity consumption and other energy consumption of your home or of your office, and it will tell you which quarter or which quartile you are in. So for the first quartile, it would be the office building with annual energy consumption less than 128 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay? And then for the second quartile, okay, so for higher energy consumption. So this is lowest energy consumption, and then higher and higher, and the highest. Okay, so for the second quartile, between 128 to 175, and then this one, and then this one larger than 222. Okay, and the unit kilowatt hour per square meter per year. So you can compare this with the UK value. So if we assume these electricity consumption, okay, kilowatt hour electricity consumption is based on the supply from the CLP, and according to the year 2023, the emission factor of CLP is 0.39 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per kilowatt hour. Then we can convert these average value into carbon dioxide emissions. Okay, so the first quartile, the average is 83. Okay, for the first quartile, for the group of office building which consume the least energy, okay, the average is 83 kilowatt hour per square meter. So if we use an emission factor of 0.39, then we can convert 83 kilowatt hour per square meter into 32. So just 83 multiply 0.39, then we can convert energy consumption per square meter into carbon emissions per square meter. So 32 kg carbon dioxide emissions per square meter. And then for the second quartile, the average 150, and for the third 198, and for the fourth 330. So we can convert these energy intensity or energy consumption intensity into carbon dioxide emissions value. Okay? So for the benchmark in the UK, they use 100, right? The author proposed the value of 100 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent. And then according to the benchmark in Hong Kong, 100 will be somewhere between the third quartile and the fourth quartile. So it seems that for Hong Kong, the buildings are very, it has low carbon emissions. But you have to understand that in the UK, the emission factor that the author used is 0.6. And then in Hong Kong, if we use the emission factor of CLP, 0.39, which is much lower than that of the UK. So that's why when you compare the emissions of the carbon dioxide, you have to understand the fuel mix of that region, okay, or the emission factor, the assumptions behind. So the average operating carbons for the 4 categories seems to be quite low compared to the UK. However, the following should be considered. Okay, only electricity consumption is taken into account. So here, this is only for electrical utilization index. And for the commercial buildings in Hong Kong, 90%, okay, 89% would be electricity. But it also consumes other kind of energy, like town gas, CLP, oil, and coal product. Okay, so this intensity, this benchmark, only consider 89% of the energy consumption, and therefore this will be lower than the actual value. Okay, and the emission factor. Okay, CLP emission factors was used, but if we use the HGC emission factor in the same year, 2023, the emission factor is much higher. Okay, because for HGC, it burns oil and natural gas mostly. Okay, no nuclear power, so the emission factor will be much higher. And the base area is the total internal area, including both the tenant and the landlord area, okay, including the landlord area also. So it means that these per square meter would be including both the tenant area and also part of the landlord area based on the proportion of the rented area. Okay? So when we compare different the data in different regions, we have to understand the assumptions behind. This is a figure extracted from a research paper in the year 2017, and it lists out the energy consumption for 30 numbers of commercial office buildings in Hong Kong. So we can see a wide variation. So the largest could be as high as like 500, okay, more than 500 kilowatt hour per square meter. So if it is referring to the benchmark here, it will be definitely in the fourth quartile. And there are also buildings which consume very less energy, okay, less than 80 kilowatt hour per square meter. Okay, and it summarized the performance for office with data center, highest energy consumption, and then office with laboratory, office with bank, with food beverage, or pure office. So for pure office, just office area, then the consumption will be the least. Okay, next, which one is larger? Embodied carbon or operating carbon. So we have learned what is embodied carbon and what is operating carbon, right? So embodied carbon is the carbon emissions due to the consumption of construction material on day one, and including due to refurbishment, renovation every few years. And for the operating carbon would be every year, and then maybe the buildings will be occupied for 50 years or longer. Okay, all these operating carbon, you can compare it with the embodied carbon and see which one is larger. Okay, this is a table that you should have seen last week. So last week we studied the embodied carbon, right? And then based on the data by the author, the typical design will result in an embodied carbon value of 700 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. Okay, this is the typical value for buildings in UK. Okay, so typical value for buildings in UK, the embodied carbon for initial embodied carbon would be 700 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And after few years, okay, there would be some fit out and then minor refurbishment, major refurbishment, and then at the end of the lifetime of the building, you also need to consume some energy and then throw away the waste to the landfill when the building is being demolished, okay, at the end of the life of the building. So based on these values, we will be able to estimate the typical office building, the embodied carbon of the typical office building in the UK in the whole lifetime, okay, in the whole life cycle, which is around like this. Okay, so let's say for the new building, the embodied carbon is 600, and then there will be 4 times of fitting out, and the average fitting out is 100, okay, 100 kg of carbon dioxide, okay, and 4 times, so 400, and then minor refurbishment, 25 each time. So if there are 2 times, twice, then 50, and for major refurbishment, okay, 100. Or here, 100 major refurbishment, and only once. So the total would be 1,150. So this is the total embodied carbon for a typical office in the UK, okay, including the initial embodied carbon and the recurring embodied carbon due to refurbishment, renovation, and fit out. All right. And then we have the operating carbon, right? So just this lesson, the author proposed a benchmark of 100, okay, 100 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter, okay? So for this table, it assumed that the operating carbon will stay the same, 100 from year 2 to year 29. Okay, but after major refurbishment, okay, maybe they have upgraded the system, and the new system is more energy efficient, such that the operating carbon will be lower, okay, like 70. And calculating the total, so from year 2 to 29, so there are 28 number of years, so 100 multiplied 28 years. So the total operating carbon in 28 years will be this value. And then for the next, how many years? 10. Okay, so for the next, not 10, for the next 30. Okay, for the next 30 years, the operating carbon every year will be 70. So multiply 30, and we have this value. So this 4,900 is the operating carbon in 60 years. All right, so we have the embodied carbon, we have the operating carbon, and for a typical office building in the UK, the operating carbon will be much larger than the total embodied carbon. Okay, so if we list out all the embodied carbon, okay, initial embodied carbon, recurring embodied carbon, and the blue color, the operating carbon, okay, would be like this. Okay, so for the construction, the initial embodied carbon would be this high, and then every year it need to consume 100. It need to consume some energy and result in 100 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter every year. Okay, the operating carbon. And then after major renovation, then the operating carbon is lower, 70. And if you add up, okay, accumulate all these embodied carbon at the end of the lifetime of the building, the total carbon, okay, the total of embodied plus operating carbon would be this high, around 6,050. Okay, at the end of the lifetime, the total emissions would be 6,050. Okay, so for a typical project, the operating carbon is usually much larger than the embodied carbon. And for a low carbon project, probably the operating carbon will be much smaller. And if it is a zero carbon project, then the operating carbon will be net zero. So maybe there are some on-site renewable energy generating plant, maybe PV panel and so on, such that the net operating carbon will be zero. Okay? So just some general recommendation. Okay, so if you still remember, before we talk about the Hong Kong case, okay, we have studied the operating carbon for different kinds of green buildings in Hong Kong. And the conclusion is that for buildings with low operating carbon, they are usually low-rise buildings and buildings located far away from the city center. And it means that for occupants, okay, in order to work in that low operating carbon buildings, they have to travel long way from their home to the office. And for these traveling, maybe by bus, maybe by driving the car or by public transport, it will lead to some transport carbon. So in order to make a fair comparison, we need to consider the transport carbon also. Okay, recap from the green building performance. So out of town office, for those offices far away from the city center, they tend to have a land area available to allow narrow floor plates. Narrow floor plates means that everywhere is close to the window. Okay, so enable effective daylighting and natural cross ventilation, and fewer noise-related or air pollution constraints on the use of openable windows. So not in the city center, then far away from the busy road, they have fresh air, not much air pollution, so they can rely on natural ventilation. Okay, easier to rely on natural ventilation. While out-of-town locations may lead to low energy consumption, the issue of how people commute, okay, travel to these offices compared to city center buildings, and the contribution this makes to the whole carbon footprint should not be ignored. Okay, so in the rest of the slides, it will consider the transport carbon. So in 2011, emissions due to transport amounted to 119 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So around 20 to 25% of UK's total carbon dioxide emissions, which is very high proportion. I think for Hong Kong it's much lower, okay, but for UK they drive often, always, okay, so it results in a very high proportion. Cars and motorcycles account for 75% of the distance traveled for commuting and business purposes. So most due to driving cars and motorcycles. The decisions on whether or not to drive to work is influenced by many factors. Okay, how far away, and then the traveling time, the cost, the availability of the car parking, and many. So I will just skip this slide. Occupants of offices in 4 different cities in the UK were surveyed for the estimation of transport carbon. So the author wants to estimate the transport carbon for different types of buildings. And these are some findings, okay, different value, different, for different region, different values. So by assuming an average occupancy of 1 person per 15 square meter of gross internal floor area, the transport carbon in kg carbon dioxide equivalent per person can be converted into per square meter of internal floor area. And the transport carbon could be higher than those due to operating energy in some office building if the building is far away from the city center. So let's say we refer to 500. So for low transport carbon, it would be maybe around 500. And then for average or medium, maybe 125. Okay, 1,250. And then for high, maybe around 2,000. Okay, so for high carbon, so maybe 2,000 value. So low transport carbon, 500. Medium, 1,250. High transport carbon, 2,000. And if we use a occupancy density of 15 square meter per person, okay, then 1,250 is per person. And if we divide it by 15 square meter per person, so 1,250 divided by 15 square meter per person, then we have 83 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. Okay? So in order to add up embodied carbon to operating carbon and then transport carbon, we have to convert them into the same unit, right? So for embodied carbon and operating carbon, the unit would be kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And for transport carbon, it depends on the numbers of occupants, right? So for an office, if we have many employees and they all drive, so it will result in larger carbon emissions. So here, the author make an assumption that the occupancy density is 15 square meter per person. And if the transport carbon, okay, using the medium, okay, as the typical value, then it can be converted into the same unit, kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And now we have the embodied carbon, we have the operating carbon, and we have the transport carbon. So we can add them up together. Okay, and this one is for annual, okay, yearly. So before we add them up, we have to multiply by the number of years. Okay, so how about Hong Kong case? According to the Hong Kong end use data, 29% of the total energy was consumed in the transport sector. 83% of the transport energy was due to oil, coal product, and then 40% due to town gas and LPG, and then remaining 4% from the electricity. Okay, so for carbon emissions, the transport sector constitutes 19.2%, which is a little bit lower than that in the UK. So for the UK, it's around 25%, and for Hong Kong, 19.2%. Okay, and 90% of the daily passenger will be by public transport, 2% by MTR, and then 4.5% by the car. And yeah, these are just some breakdown for your reference. The emission factor for MTR will be around 0.055 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per passenger per km. And this is the data in the year 2017. So I think the current emission factor will be lower, but I cannot find out the more updated value. So if you are like me, go back to work by MTR, then you can try to evaluate your transport carbon. Okay, try to estimate how long did you travel by the MTR. Like I live in Fo Tang and then I work in the Hong Kong station. So I can estimate the distance from Fo Tang to Hong Kong and then Hong Kong back to Fo Tang and then multiply by the emission factor. So that would be my transport carbon for one trip, one day. Okay, so we have the embodied carbon, the operating carbon, and now finally we convert the transport carbon into the same unit, kg of carbon dioxide per square meter. So now we can add them up, add these three components together so as to calculate the whole carbon footprint. And the whole carbon footprint will be a more fair comparison, okay, for their global warming impact. So the whole carbon footprint is defined as the greenhouse gas emissions associated with 1, 2, 3. Okay, operating energy, embodied energy, and the transport energy. So for operating energy would be not just electricity, but also gas and other fuel used in the building, services, the equipment, everything. And the embodied energy would be the energy consumed for manufacturing, delivering, installing the materials used to build, fit out, refurbish the building. Okay, we have the initial embodied and then the recurring embodied due to renovation, refurbishment after few years. And the transport energy, the energy used to get people to and from the building. So we can convert energy into carbon when we have the emission factor. So the carbon emissions for operating, embodied, and transport are in different formats, and some assumptions need to be made to combine them into a single comparable matrix. So for operating carbon, every year, okay, annual operating carbon and per square meter, and for embodied carbon per square meter, and for transport carbon, okay, per person, per year, or we can, based on the occupancy density, we can convert it into per square meter per year. Okay, and in order to make them to add them up, we also need to assume the lifetime of the building. So in the coming few slides, we assume that a building can last for 60 years. Okay, can last for 60 years. So the calculation would be something like this. This is the table that you have seen earlier for embodied carbon. And then this is also the table you have seen earlier, the embodied carbon, total embodied carbon, and the operating carbon over 60 years. Okay, this is the total operating carbon over 60 years. And this is the total embodied carbon for a building that can last for 60 years. Okay, and for the transport carbon, this is also the table that we have seen earlier. So for low transport carbon, if we assume 15 square meter per person, okay, then we can convert the unit from per person to per square meter. Okay, so for low transport carbon, the transport carbon would be 33 kg of carbon dioxide per square meter. And for medium, 83, for high, 133. So now we want to add up all these values. So once again, we need to make some assumption. Okay, the footprint will be based on 1 year of greenhouse gas emissions, and the unit per square meter, and the occupancy density, 15 square meter per person. The annual embodied carbon will equal to the total greenhouse gas emissions over 60 years divided by 60. So we want to find out the whole carbon footprint each year. So for operating carbon, it is based on 1 year. Transport carbon, it can also be calculated based on 1 year. But for the embodied carbon, it is for the whole building lifetime. So if we assume the building can last for 60 years, then the total embodied carbon divided by 60 will be the average embodied carbon in a year. Okay, so that's the meaning. So this is the calculations for the whole carbon footprint. So for operating carbon, we assume 1 year, 100 kg carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, this is the benchmark suggested by the author. And then for the embodied carbon, this 12, so how did, where does this 12 come from? So if the initial embodied carbon is assumed to be 700, okay, like in this table, okay, 700, the initial embodied carbon, okay, 700. And 700 is a initial embodied carbon for a building that can last for 60 years. So if we divide it by 60 years, then this is the initial embodied carbon in a year. All right? And for the refurbishment, just the same, okay, based on the, okay, 100 would be the fitting out, okay, and 3 times, and then minor refurbishment, and then the major refurbishment also divided by 60 number of years. Then we have 8. So this 12 and 8 would be calculated in this way. And then we have the transport carbon. The typical high and low, okay, they are extracted here, 33, 83, 133, and here. So we can combine them, okay, add up the operating carbon, typical, embodied carbon, typical, and transport carbon, typical. So it results in the whole carbon footprint for typical office building in UK will be around 200 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter of internal floor area every year, okay, in a year. So I would say these figures, they are for your reference, and these figures are based on some assumptions. So the exact figures, they are not too important, okay, they are just for your reference. But all these slides, they meant to explain to you how a whole carbon footprint can be generated. Okay, how can we calculate the whole carbon footprint? And it is based on the same unit. Okay. So the whole, the carbon footprint breakdown for an office building in the UK using the typical benchmark for each category. So it will be, the proportion will be around like this. So the operating carbon around half, and then 41% the transport carbon, and then initial embodied carbon, recurring embodied carbon around 10%. Okay, so this is based on 1 year, not the whole lifetime, but 1 year. Okay. These are the calculations of the operating carbon, embodied carbon, and the transport carbon based on real buildings. Okay, so once again, they are for your reference. Okay, these are based on real buildings. And if we illustrate these data in a figure, then it will be something like this. So for a almost zero carbon office building in rural area, the operating carbon is expected to be low, right? Because it is a almost zero carbon building and it is located in the rural area. Okay, so the operating carbon must be low. Okay, and this is the embodied carbon. And because this building is located far away from the city center in the rural area, therefore the transport carbon is very high. Okay, this is the transport carbon. The orange color is the transport carbon. And then comparing to another extreme, like an existing prestige office building in London, in city center. So the operating carbon will be very high, okay, very large, because, yeah, prestige, so probably air conditioned, and then maybe, the service is higher grade, so they provide very good, very comfortable environment, so the energy consumption could be very high for operation. But at the same time, because the building is located in the city center, so the transportation will be shorter, and therefore the transport carbon will also be smaller. So comparing these two buildings, the first building is so-called a almost zero carbon building. So from the name, almost zero carbon building, it seems that the performance must be very good, the carbon emissions must be very low. And then another building, just an existing office building in the city center in UK. So it seems that the performance must be very poor, right, in terms of carbon emissions. But if we use the whole carbon footprint concept to do the analysis, it is found that their difference is actually not too obvious. Okay, still, the existing building in the city center has a higher whole carbon footprint, but the difference is actually not very large. Okay, that's the main point. So the observation, okay, it is difficult to achieve a building that has low carbon emissions in all the three categories. And the majority of low carbon green buildings tend to be low-rise, okay, 4-story with layout that enable natural ventilation, utilization of daylight, and on-site renewables to be utilized effectively. Many of these are located in the rural or edge-of-town locations, far away from the city center, and are therefore likely to have high transport emissions, okay, just like the almost zero carbon building that we have seen earlier, okay, far away from the city center, and therefore result in high transport carbon. The operating carbon of many of the densely occupied, highly utilized air-conditioned office building in the city centers can be excessive. Okay, so for the existing buildings in London, okay, the operating carbon can be very high. Okay, so the benchmark is 100, but for this building, almost 200. Okay, maybe 170, much higher than the benchmark. When the whole carbon footprint is taken into consideration, into account, including the occupation, the travel, then the difference in the total carbon emissions compared to the exemplar green building, the so-called zero carbon building, may not be as significant as one might assume. Okay, so that's the major observations. Okay, so based on the same book, the author proposed a whole carbon footprint benchmark of 200 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter per year. And you have to understand that this is based on certain assumptions, like the occupancy density and the operation schedule. So an office with longer hours of use, higher occupancy density may appear to perform poorly compared to the less intensively used buildings. So this benchmark is based on a certain population density and based on certain operation hour. Okay? And the primary inputs. So in order to calculate the whole carbon footprint, okay, and then compare to the benchmark, you need to know the floor area, annual energy consumption, the embodied carbon, the travel emissions per person, okay, like the distance, and then by MTR or by vehicle, by driving, or you walk to office, the occupancy density, the operation hours in a year, and then the emission factors for electricity, for town gas, and other energy, and also the frequency of fitting out and refurbishment, okay, so as to calculate the recurring embodied carbon. So you see, in order to find out the whole carbon footprint, we need all these data. And it's difficult to find out all these data, especially the travel emissions per person. Okay, so you have to collect so many data. Okay, so major summary for the whole lesson. So the very best performing green office in the UK have an operating carbon of around 30 to 40 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And these are typically owner-occupied. Okay, so one owner only. And low-rise building, 2 to 4 stories, have openable window and far away from the city center. Majority of the air-conditioned commercial buildings in the UK rarely have operating carbon smaller than 100, smaller than the benchmark, okay, 100, and some higher than 200. And operating carbon benchmark for the office building is proposed to be 100, okay, 100 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And for the transport carbon, the range will be around 750 to 1,500. And if we convert it into per square meter, it will be around 83 in average. Okay, the medium will be 83 kg of carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. The transport carbon can be higher than the operating carbon in some office building, like for the office building far away from the city center. And a whole carbon footprint benchmark is proposed to be 200 kg carbon dioxide equivalent per square meter. And it is based on a lifetime of 60 years. And finally, we need not only low operating carbon or low transport carbon, we need all of them together to be small. Okay, so whole carbon footprint. Okay, so that's the main point. Okay, we consider not only the embodied carbon, not just the operating, but the whole carbon footprint concept. And it is a combination of embodied, operating, and transport carbon. All right. Okay, so this is the last slide. I think I will just stop here. And I understand that in today's lecture, there are many calculations, so many numbers. But these numbers, you don't need to memorize them, okay? It's not meaningful to memorize them, okay? Because they are based on many assumptions. Occupancy density, and then operation patterns, and many others like the emission factors, okay? So I just want you to understand, if you really need to calculate the whole carbon footprint, what would be the calculations, procedures, what data that you need. And from time to time, very often, you will need to make some assumptions, okay? So I will stop here, and then next week, we will talk about some mitigation, some emissions reduction strategies. So see you next week.